When one stumbles upon a cotton voile with very pretty colors but a completely random pattern, there's not much to be done but make it into a mid-1940s summer shirt dress regardless of the current season. A couple of months ago, during Mood's cotton voile sale, I found this fabric and absolutely loved it, mostly because of the colors, but also because the large and albeit rather historically inaccurate pattern reminded me of novelty dresses from the mid-40s. They weren't that common, but were very, very fun, and featured patterns like hot air balloons and accordions. For the shirt dress itself, I knew I couldn't add too many gathered details and style lines and things like that because it would get lost in the pattern, so I decided to embrace it and make the shirt dress as simple and basic as possible. The only detail being tucks at the bodice waist, mirrored at the skirt waist on front and back. I also decided to use a self-drafted pattern made from my block pattern because I think pattern drafting is a really useful skill to have, and it also saves me a bit of money, which is always a good thing. I did Frankenstein a lot of the pieces together from other patterns, mostly from Simplicity-4425, a very common shirt dress pattern that I followed around a year ago, so I already had it traced onto my own paper, which was very convenient. I used the entire foregore skirt from that pattern, ignoring the gathering and tucking it to fit as I sewed. The only thing I drafted myself, actually, was the bodice, and all I did to alter that for my block was replace the waist darts with indications to tuck, add a bit of ease at the side seams, split the front piece for more fullness, add extra to the shoulders for shoulder pads, and trace all the necessary facings. Since the filming of this video, I've used the shirtwaist pattern twice to make blouses and have had to make a few alterations, but this early version is really quite good, but that may be because dresses are a little more forgiving than blouses. I believe I took the sleeve pattern from Simplicity-4425 and trimmed it to work as a shorter sleeve, but I'm not exactly sure where the collar piece came from, possibly from McCall4854, a plain 1940s blouse pattern. I'm sure it's self-evident, but you've been watching me pin and cut my pieces, making sure the plastic bags are facing the right way. Next, I marked the darts on the front and back of the bodice using tailor's chalk. I've since switched to a disappearing ink pen and a ruler because it's a lot easier to be precise than with the chalk. That's right, folks, I've moved out of the 19th century. I used a pencil to mark the tucks, then I repeated the same thing on all the other darts. Then I pinned all the darts after marking the fabric on the wrong side, thus feeling true pain. I then clipped all the notches, which consisted of the top of the sleeve cap, 2 indications for the end of the gathering threads on the sleeves, and a couple of notches from the skirt pattern that seemed redundant to me, but I marked anyway. After doing all my preliminary work, I gratefully began sewing all the darts. If it wasn't evident already, marking small, medium, and large O's that half the time mean absolutely nothing important is not my favorite part of the project. After my 4 darts were sewn, I began pinning the shoulder seams and side seams before moving on to the waist tucks. In a Montgomery Ward's catalog, I saw a pair of overalls with tucks angled outwards from the center front, and I thought it looked quite flattering, so I decided to try it on my shirtwaist. I then basted them in place by machine, just sewing them over the folds instead of sewing them like proper tucks because of the shape I was going for. Then I sewed the side and shoulder seams of the bodice, then undid half of one of the side seams to make room for the closure. When I was sewing the collar, I sewed the shorter end instead of the longer end, so I unpicked that and sewed it correctly off camera. However, I did run into a rather large problem after this step. So my block pattern has a fatal flaw that has evaded correction for months and months because it only really becomes evident once you sew a collar into it, a step that I don't do in mock-ups. The neckline is extremely large. I guess my brain just can't comprehend how small 1/4 of the full neckline actually is on a pattern piece. Anyway, I wasn't keen on tolerating this for yet another project, and I didn't have any extra fabric, so I decided to try something a little bit scary. I found that it fit much better if I pinched 2 inches out of the back, but I didn't want a center back seam on a shirt dress, just didn't seem right to me, so I created a back yoke. After pulling a thread to create a perfectly straight line, I cut off the top of the back and took out my 2 inches in the center. Luckily, the pattern aligns so that the seam lay on the white part of the fabric, making it nearly invisible because none of the pattern was cut off. Then I took 2 tucks out of the bottom half of the back piece to make up for the fullness I just cut out, and top stitched it all together, using as small of a seam allowance I could get away with. With that, I could stitch up the side and shoulder seams that I'd unpicked to do the alterations, and proceeded with the collar and facings. The neckline is still a bit large, but I took out as much as I could without seriously altering the fit. Of course, I clipped the neckline curve once I'd sewn through the collar and the facing, being careful not to clip my line of stitching. Then I stay stitched around the facing, which is a technique used to encourage the facing to stay on the inside of the garment by stitching it to the seam allowance. Next, I could begin working on the sleeves, first adding a gathering thread along the sleeve cap even though there's no decorative gathering, to make setting them easier. I then sewed them together at the underarm and began setting. Recently, I was reading a 1940s sewing guide, Frances Talbot's The Complete Book of Sewing, when I came across the greatest advice of all time. When setting basic sleeves such as this one, it's much easier to leave the side seam on the garment and the corresponding seam on the sleeve undone and set the sleeve flat, which is absolutely mind-blowing. I tried it recently, and it was in fact much easier and faster. I'm not sure if the traditional method is better for sleeves with gathering or darts or any other details at the cap, but I will certainly be using this method from now on with my blouses and shirt dresses. The bodice was pretty much finished, so I figured it would be a pretty good time to put in the shoulder pads to get the final fit in case there were any issues that needed to be addressed. I created the cotton poplin square, then began stuffing it with scrap fabric. This was a bad idea because after the dress got washed, some of the scraps inside shrunk a little and were also shifted around, so the pad had to be reshaped before I could wear it again. Coincidentally, the Complete Book of Sewing also has a solution for this problem as well. For washed dresses, Miss Talbot recommends creating a frill out of a stiff taffeta and sewing it to the arm's eye seam, which again is really smart. I tried it, and you just have to make sure to use a pattern without a really square shoulder because it creates a really small amount of volume, at least with the cotton poplin I use. Maybe taffeta gives a stronger result. Anyway, the construction of my shoulder pads is pretty self-explanatory. After I stuffed it, I sewed the open edge closed by machine, then sewed 2 lines of stitching along one of the diagonals and cut it into 2. I then stitched it to my dress at the 3 corners and in the center of the long side. Next, I could begin working on the skirt, which again, as I said, is 4 gores, which I pinned together and sewed at the center back and center front. To determine the placement and size of the tucks, I pinned the bodice and front 2 gores of the skirt together at the side seams and center front, and gathered out the fullness in the skirt, lining it up with the pre-existing tucks. It would be much easier if I had the dress form, as the bodice is currently hanging on a shirt hanger which is hooked to a lamp. I guess I could have done it properly with measurements and such, or even, God forbid, marking it all on my pattern beforehand, but math. After basting all the tucks like I did on the bodice, I sewed the side seams of the skirt and pinked them, leaving the top few inches of one of them open for the closure. With the final scraps of plastic bag fabric, I pieced together a waistband, making sure I used scraps with the pattern facing upwards for the front part of the waistband. I also had to add a side seam due to fabric constraints. I decided to top stitch it on for a cleaner look. One of the last things I did was buttonholes. Believe it or not, I've never actually sewn a buttonhole by hand before in my life. By the end of the project, I'm always anxious to finish so that I can wear whatever I make, so I never have the patience to try doing it by hand. Then I began sewing the buttons on in extremely aesthetic lighting. I have windows that really only get direct light enough to film by in the morning with a very small area, so if I could, I would have filmed the entire video like this, but alas, most of it was filmed in late afternoon or evening. Think of these shots as a gift to all you who haven't clicked off yet while we mourn the loss of the retention rate on this video. I sewed some hooks and eyes directly into the place on the dress I'd left partially open, because I couldn't be bothered making a placket this late in the project. Lastly, back in the aesthetic lighting, I pinned up the hem and sewed it by hand, fighting my impatience the whole time. With that, the dress was finished. I think, especially for the bodice being self-drafted, the silhouette is pretty accurate. The fit I was able to achieve was well worth the extra time I took to work out the pattern. It also feels a bit more like my own dress, even though the design is rather plain and most of it I took from other people's patterns. The only problem I have with it is that the fit of the neckline still isn't perfect. It's a lot better than what it was, but at the moment the larger neckline adds a touch of modernity to it and it looks a bit out of place. Also, pretend you don't see how wrinkly it is. I didn't want to iron it in case the sun went away. So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe. I've got a super exciting project coming this summer that I can't wait to share with you all. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.